It's Tuesday, February 17th, 2026. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. We are in another government shutdown, but just a little one. After not being able to agree on a way to fund the Department of Homeland Security, Congress then took off for a 10-day break. Now, we'll get into what that means for federal workers and for you, but mostly we're going to be talking about the Democratic Party trying to stick to its guns, while Republicans are trying to say that they can either fund ICE or they can block voter ID. We'll talk about it. But first, make sure you're following or subscribed to the show wherever you can get your podcasts. Leave a comment or a review. It really helps the show get seen by more people. And sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got 2 new newsletters this week. First, from Things You Forgot from Civics Class, it's all about how congressional recesses work and why Congress seems to take so many breaks. And actually, the history of how recesses work is super interesting. Like, despite D.C. being miserable in the summer forever and the air in the Capitol being so bad that researchers think it killed like 25 members of Congress, there wasn't a summer recess until 1970. And then this weekend I launched Make It Make Nonsense, a new weekly dive into the non-political things that are keeping me sane. This week, it's about the Netflix show that I want to see about the ice masters at the Winter Olympic Games. If you've been watching the Olympics, you've probably seen the people who are like using overgrown hair dryers on ski jumps, or the guys who moonwalk down the sheets to make them ready for curling. I also talk about 30 years of Pokemon and being flooded with 2000s nostalgia for the last week. And I ask whether I would look good in a cowboy hat, because my algorithm really seems to think that I need one. Now, both of those newsletters are for paid subscribers only, but you could become a subscriber for as little as $5 a month. That's probably less than your cup of coffee or matcha, which is also today's sponsor, Mantra Matcha. If you're looking for a way to cut back on overly jittery caffeine like I've been, Mantra is the way to go. They've got tons of great fruit-infused flavors, or that classic matcha taste if that's your thing. It just delivers some steady energy without the jitters. It helps improve my focus and reduces stress, which I think we could use a little bit of right now. You can get 15% off your next order from Mantra Matcha using the code MIMS25. A link is in the show notes to check it out. All right, let's get on with the show. On Friday last week, the House and the Senate broke for the long weekend because yesterday was President's Day, and then a 10-day recess after not being able to find a way to keep DHS up and running. The major dispute is over demands from Democrats about rules for ICE, which is tricky because over the summer, in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, ICE as an agency was given $75 million of its own that doesn't run out until 2029, effectively making it shutdown-proof. Now, there are still tons of concerns about that money, specifically how it can be actually separated from overall DHS funding, even on paper, but I try to keep this show as math-free as possible, so we're not going to dive into that today. What this shutdown does mean, though, is that TSA, FEMA, cybersecurity, the Coast Guard, and the Secret Service are all working without pay right now, and that could affect a lot of ways that you live your life, especially if you're planning on traveling in the next few days. And Speaker of the House Mike Johnson laid the blame for those things directly at the feet of Democrats last week, saying this partial shutdown means, quote, delayed disaster aid, airport chaos, a weakened law enforcement. Democrats are once again risking public safety just to stage a pointless political stunt. Now, you can quibble with whether it's a political stunt or not. One person's stunt is often another person's attempt to stand up for civil rights, but it's worth pointing out that it's been the Trump administration that has pushed to eliminate FEMA altogether and withheld $11 billion in disaster relief to states just last year. The FAA has also pushed some 2,700 employees to take buyouts amid historic shortfalls in employment, while just this week announcing it was doubling down on purging diversity from airlines, which no doubt will cause airport chaos. And when it comes to weakening law enforcement, the Trump administration has gutted cybersecurity so much that states are having to run their own, and more than 4,000 Department of Justice employees were fired in just the first 6 months of last year. So I don't know if that's the specific road that Johnson should be hoeing here from a political standpoint, but it's definitely the mildest take about the shutdown for Republicans. And before we get to those takes, you do need to know what demands Democrats are making, which Republicans have called non-starters. Democrats have 10 demands of DHS that fit into 3 categories, we'll say. First, how ICE operates with members of the public. So that's things like no more masks. Agents must identify themselves, and agents have to have standardized uniforms. Next is how they operate when they enforce the law, which are things like needing to get warrants from actual judges to enter homes and businesses, ending racial profiling, ending ICE agents going into hospitals, churches, and schools, and upholding existing use of force laws. And then finally, Democrats have demands about oversight. That includes having every agent wear a body camera. DHS has to share investigation information with state and local authorities, and it has to follow the laws about how immigrant detention centers are run by following health standards, upholding constitutional rights, and allowing members of Congress to drop in unannounced, which is considered an official duty of Congress by law. Now, I know that that's a lot, but we need to talk about just 2 of the non-starters here because they're the ones that are being put front and center by the GOP. That's officer identification, including mask wearing for starters. Here's Trump's border czar Tom Homan talking about it this weekend on CBS.
As far as the mask, look, I don't like the masks either. But because threats against ICE officers, are up over 1,500%. Actual assaults and threats are up over 8,000%. These men and women have to protect themselves. As far as identifying themselves, they all have placards identifying themselves as ICE, ERO, HSI, DEA, FBI. So they all have placards on them. So I'll let the White House...
So for starters, we can agree that when people are demanding DHS agents identify themselves, they mean name and badge. That's pretty standard law enforcement stuff. Partially because if all that's required for you to be an officer is a Velcro placard, then there are an awful lot of new officers running around every year on Halloween, right? But let's talk about those numbers that Homan just rattled off because they are so high that they should set off alarm bells. That threats to ICE agents are up 1,500%, and that assaults and threats combined are up 8,000%. Those numbers aren't really what they sound like. First of all, let's talk about actual assaults. What Homan and the administration appear to want people to think is that ICE agents are just being randomly assaulted as they're standing around or in a neighborhood, but that's not the case. What's actually happening is that in the course of ICE and DHS rapidly expanding, extremely aggressive enforcement, there are more incidents that DHS is initially classifying as assault, which can include the perception of resisting arrest. As the data journalist Philip Bump put it, a central reason that assaults against ICE officers have spiked since Trump took office is that there are more officers engaged in more actions and conducting more arrests. On top of that, Politico just reported today, based on internal ICE documents, that for at least a year, ICE knew that its agents were getting out of control when it came to using excessive force, with an eye for ginning up assault allegations. The head of the ICE Training Academy, a guy named Chris Vitello, wrote last year that he wanted officials to, quote, package up a summary of the needed elements of the crime, definitions of what constitutes assault, with the intention of broadcasting to the workforce in an effort to drive more presentations for prosecution. Effectively, what he's saying there is not only is ICE being more aggressive, but they are actively looking to draw assaults to charge people with and telling agents how to make those things work. But even when you look at the assaults that have led to charges, 2 independent investigations, one by the LA Times and one by NPR, found that claims of assaults being up 1,000% just don't hold water. 40% of the cases brought in California, where some of the most immigration enforcement happened in 2025, were dismissed, with another 40% still pending, and there was not a single case where a person was convicted, though 30 did take plea deals. And then you had the number of threats. Again, there's some twisting of what they're counting as threats versus what are actual criminal threats, which the Supreme Court has been very careful to say that criminal threats are when a speaker directs a threat to a person with the intent of placing the victim in fear of bodily harm or death, and that the speaker has to subjectively believe that the person to whom his words were directed would perceive them as threatening of violence. So that means that just because a person is afraid of a thing that is said doesn't necessarily mean that it rises to the level of criminal threats. Despite that, DHS seems to be using threats that are on signs at protests or online anti-ICE posts, or even just calls for doxing agents as threats and then combining them with the assault allegations to get to that 8,000% number. And let's talk about doxing here. If you don't know what that is, it's the act of publishing someone's personal information online to then commit violence on them or their families. And that's been a big reason that we've been told ICE agents need to wear masks, except Philip Bump, the same guy from before, found there hasn't been a single instance of an ICE agent being identified, having their private information released, and then attacked on or off duty. Now, there have been a few isolated instances of agents being identified, and even a man arrested in California for allegedly doxing an attorney who was working for ICE, but that doesn't make it widespread. And as the conservative Cato Institute found, 2025 was actually the second safest year to be a member of Border Patrol or ICE since DHS was founded. And the American public also doesn't want ICE to wear masks because we generally like the idea of knowing who police are because they're public servants, not civilians. A new NBC poll out from just this month, like 11 days ago, found 63% of Americans disagreed with ICE agents being able to wear masks, and 67% said they think ICE has gone too far in its enforcement. So, if these assault numbers aren't really happening the way that ICE is saying, and threats aren't really happening in the way they want us to believe, and Americans don't like the masks, then why keep them? Well, as Adam Serwer put it in The Atlantic this week, when violating the Constitution on a daily basis, a mask helps because people who are assured that they won't face consequences for abusing power almost inevitably do. And speaking of that abuse, let's go to the other non-starter that Republicans have right now, which is DHS needing actual warrants from an actual judge. You see, right now, ICE agents carry what are called administrative warrants, which aren't the same as regular criminal warrants because they don't have to convince a judge that there's probable cause to let federal agents raid your home. This is how former ICE Assistant Director Scott Schuchart explained it to me less than 2 weeks ago.
So traditionally, ICE has had an ability to do what's called an administrative warrant, which is just a piece of paper that you print out of the computer and have a supervisor sign that allows them to take people into civil custody for removal. And that kind of a warrant can only be served in a public area. It doesn't allow them to break down your door and come into your house to arrest you. To break down your door and come into your house to arrest you requires an arrest warrant signed by a judge.
So that makes sense, that these things aren't the same, right? Well, not unless you listen to Republicans like Minnesota Representative and the number 3 guy in Congress, Tom Emmer.
That warrant one. You already have administrative warrants, and Americans, if they were told the truth by these guys, would understand in order to get an administrative warrant, the defendant, the subject of the warrant, has already had full due process. Now they want what they say is a judicial warrant. And on its face, it sounds reasonable, right? Well, we got to get a judicial warrant. The administrative warrant is already the same thing. Putting a judicial warrant on top of that, you'll never get a judicial warrant in the timely manner that you need to get it.
So obviously these warrants aren't the same. And what DHS wants is to be able to be as aggressive as possible without getting bogged down in things like the constitutional right to due process or privacy, even though the Department of Homeland Security does say that the people who have these warrants out for them have gone through due process. That's just not the case. Now, the GOP has issues with all of the Democratic demands, but those are the big two. And now, Republicans are trying to conflate funding DHS with their new voter ID bill, the SAVE Act, which I talked about last week, as having the outcome of likely disenfranchising millions of voters who mostly vote for Democrats while not doing anything to stop voter fraud because voter fraud is so low that it's basically zero. And before I go on, I need to make a quick correction. Last week, I said that the SAVE Act required people to show a real ID compliant ID that also proved citizenship when they go to vote. And that included only real IDs and passports. Well, it's not entirely true, because it's actually fewer IDs than that. You see, not every real ID proves you're a citizen. The only ones that do are enhanced licenses that let you cross into North American countries without a passport. Those are only offered in 5 states: Minnesota, Michigan, New York, Vermont, and Washington. Now, ironically, 4 of those 5 states voted against Trump in the 2024 election. But it means that even if you have a real ID under this new bill, you still wouldn't be able to vote. Anyway, Republicans are trying to conflate passing the SAVE Act and voter ID as the same as unmasking federal officers. Their argument is transparency, and a majority of Americans want voter ID, which is true. Pew Research found that 83% of Americans support voter ID laws. Both Democrats and Republicans have a disconnect here. Both are saying that the thing that they like is popular and therefore should be law, while ignoring the popularity of the thing they don't like. But that's kind of only if you look at them at the surface. Wanting ICE agents to not wear masks and opposing voter ID are actually coming from the same place. They're about protecting the rights of Americans. In the case of masks, it's about having accountability for agents who have routinely abused the civil rights of citizens and non-citizens alike. When it comes to voter ID, having overly strict voter ID laws prevents people from voting, which is an American right. On the other side, wanting agents to mask up and forcing people to jump through unnecessary hoops to vote restrict the right to vote and expand assaults on civil rights, which are all based on numbers that fall apart as soon as you look a little harder at them. And I know that's inconvenient for people who like voter ID or who are worried about the safety of officers, and I am by no means saying that we should put officers or their families at risk or stop enforcing the laws already in the books that prevent voter fraud. What I'm saying is across American history, the arc of the law has been towards increasing and protecting rights, not the other way around. So, what does this all mean for this partial shutdown? Well, it looks like Republicans are setting up a choice for Democrats. They can either kill voter ID or they can get what they want with ICE, but not both. And right now, there doesn't seem to be an end in sight to this shutdown, and Congress doesn't come back to work for another 6 days. All right. That is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack to get this brand new edition of Things You Forgot from Civics Class, and make sure that you get Make It Make Nonsense in your inbox every Sunday. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant_Herms on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you on Thursday.